Asp.NET Core 3 is out, and there's some subtle changes to that magic that happens at process start. Let's mash on that.
Hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Asp.NET Monsters. Today's episode, we're going to take a look at the generic host, which is a new feature in Asp.NET Core 3.0. And this is going to be the first in a series of episodes that we do on new stuff in Asp.NET Core. Take it away, Dave.
Yeah, so the host, if you're not familiar, is the thing basically that fires up right when your process starts. And it's the thing that calls into your startup and wires up all your services and starts up any background processes that need to. So in the case of a web host, which is probably our most common scenario where we have a web application that we're building with ASP.NET Core, there's the concept of a service that runs that basically just sits there and listens for HTTP requests to come in and then processes them. That's basically Kestrel that runs in the background. There's a whole bunch of magic that happens for that to get started up when your application starts. And the way that used to work in previous versions of ASP.NET Core is there were two different kinds of host. There was something called a web host, which is the one that would fire up Kestrel in the background. And then there was another one called a generic host that would be used if we were running something that maybe was a background service and didn't involve listening for HTTP requests, for web requests to come in. And those have kind of been merged into something just called a host. So there's now just a host builder. And the easiest way to look at this is to just fire up a new project here. Everybody's favorite dialog. We'll create a new ASP.NET Core 3.0 project.
I can tell that you're a seasoned developer because it's Web Application 16.
Yeah, I'm a little embarrassed it's so low. But okay, so I'm just going to do an empty project here and selecting ASP.NET Core 3 and hit create. And what we want to look at here is program.cs. So basically every ASP.NET Core application is just a console app. There's a program main that gets executed when the application starts up, when the process starts, and that calls a method within that program class called create HostBuilder. And this is the thing that has changed here in this version. So we have host.createDefaultBuilder. Every ASP.NET Core process now kind of starts out with that exact same thing, whereas previously, and we can look at the release notes here and see what that used to look like. Oh, my bad. I'm looking at the wrong place. Okay, so what that used to look like in previous versions was we had webhost.createDefaultBuilder, and then we told it what our startup class was. So that just looks a little bit different now, whereas it's a little bit more generic and can be used by any type of process. And in one of our next episodes here, we're going to look at some of the different types of processes. So this one is still just a web process, and it does a .configure web host defaults. And then within there tells it what our startup class is. So what I wanted to do in this episode was actually step into this code. So we're going to kind of peel back the layers and look at what's actually happening here, try to demystify some of that magic that happens when the process starts. So I have my Visual Studio set up to debug into the .NET source code, and it should have downloaded the symbols for that source, and we'll see if we can actually step into this now. Okay, so our process has started. I'm going to F11 into that, and F11 into this. Okay, so the first thing we end up in here is that create default builder. So this is going to do a few things that are just common to all different types of ASP.NET applications, whether they're web or not. And one of those is setting the content route. Another one of those is configuring, adding environment variables. So this is, I think, maybe a little bit new to .NET Core 3. You might be familiar with like the ASP.NET _ environment variables that are used for a web process. There's now also the concept of these .NET _ environment variables that get added. And then also the command line arguments that can be used for config. And then this is where all that config is wired up for things like your app settings. And so the default app settings.json, and then the environment specific app settings, user secrets if we happen to be in development. That's where all of this gets set up. And then all those defaults for login. It's not all just magic that happens, I guess, when this process starts. It's all just code that gets executed by default as part of that create default builder. So that's the config and the login that gets done by default. Let's step into the next part of this. Okay, so now we're in the configure web host default. So now that we have the default builder, we're adding the things that are specific to the web host. So if we go into here, this is where we now create the default web pieces, and this is where we start pulling in the web specific parts. So here we set those config, the ones that we were familiar with before, the ASP.NET Core _ environment variables, and some host specific configuration, getting some other defaults for the web host, and basically all the services that Kestrel is going to need to run in the background and process web requests. So that all happens, more magic. And then it's going to go through, now that we have our builder set up, it's going to go through and build it. And there's a few things that happen there, just sets up the basic services that it needs. And we can just step through these. There isn't too much interesting here. And then it's going to go and get the host, which in this case is going to be, let's see what it actually was. So it is a type of Microsoft extensions hosting.internal.host. And for some reason, I can't step into this. I'm not exactly sure why, but I did go and peek at that source code. And what it does is basically just goes and grabs any host services that have been defined and just starts them in a background thread. So in this case, that happens to be the web host, which is the Kestrel process that's going to run in a background thread. And that's everything that happens in the background of getting an ASP.NET Core 3.0 process started up.
So it looks like a lot of the, like if you go back to earlier in the like even the ASP.NET days or whatever, when there were either parts of that configuration and startup pipeline that were completely, they're baked in, they're part of a DLL that you couldn't touch or modify. Yeah. This isn't the same thing though, right? Like because these are just using the defaults, but we can change it and do our own, right?
Yeah, there's always extension methods provided that allow us to make changes to whatever the defaults are. So it'll set up the defaults for the builder, but then I also have the opportunity in here, for example, to make changes to however my logging was specified, how it was configured, however configuration was configured, even Kestrel. There's should be I forget what the extension method is, but with it on that host builder, there's extension methods provided so that you can override any of those defaults that are provided. But
clear out any of the default settings, change your dependency injection providers, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So it probably makes sense then that if you're going to make changes, you probably want to do that at the end of these, like after the create default build and configure web defaults.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because ordering is important for this one.
Yes, they are, because if we made changes to configuration before the web host was created, then web host might go and override those for us. Yeah, so the order is important for sure.
This sounds like that builder pattern from the Ganga 4 book.
Yeah, it totally is. No real changes. Well, so the structure of the startup class is the same. We have configure services and configure. The thing that has changed that we'll maybe jump into in another episode here is this concept of endpoint routing has changed and is a little bit more consistent again with all the different flavors of how you can configure an ASP.NET app. So that's probably the biggest change that you'll notice is this use endpoints at the end of your configure method. Yeah, today's focus was around this concept of the host builder, what it really is, and how we've kind of standardized into just a default builder now.
Nice. Yeah, it definitely seems like this has taken a couple of versions to iterate and get right, but I'm pretty enthusiastic about the way it is. And of course, it's a Microsoft product, so what's the saying? It's got to be like version 3 before it's good.
That's where we are.
This is version 3, so this is the good one.
Yeah, it felt like it felt like the anti-play to that original, to where we like in days of yore, was to put everything out there, and all of the heavy lifting you had to do. It was all part of your startup class and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And now it's been abstracted away, but it's still done in a configurable way that allows us to compose the application in the way that's going to work for us, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely a far cry from like what existed in, what was it called, Asp.Net Core 5 or ASP MVC 5. The original idea. And that exposed a lot more. So like the templates contained a lot of stuff. And now that's being shifted kind of into library code, and the templates are much cleaner again.
Yeah. A lot of, in the original versions, like in ASP.NET vNext, back when they used to call it that, the early betas of this, and even in V1, a lot of the code that's inside of Create Default Builder was code that was included in the program CS or in startup.cs as part of the new project templates.
Yeah, this one's been growing and shrinking, like different versions, right? Depending on where you are in the beta or the alpha versions and stuff. Yeah.
So it used to look like a lot of code that was generated, or there used to be a lot of code that was generated as part of a new project, and now it's down to, for this, what they call, I always laugh, they call it the empty project, which isn't empty because it clearly contains something. But it's the emptiest it can be. And there's not a lot there.
And the thing is, though, is that like 9 times out of 10 for most projects, you might go and change a line or two of what was in there, or you might have a section where you're like setting up your container if you're using something other than the default container or whatever. But for the most part, it was just a lot of code that you weren't using, and that's what's, I think, allowed them to roll it up into this library approach, as Simon said.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things we're going to look at in upcoming episodes here is that part of introducing this concept of a default builder, it was that we have a lot more consistency across all the project templates. So there's lots of different, I'll call them flavors of ASP.NET Core now, but no matter which one you're doing, everything up to basically line 20 here is going to be the same. It's always starts out with creating a default host builder, and then it's what you tack on after that changes it slightly. And so just as a little preview of what we're going to look at if we go to create a new ASP.NET Core project. It's kind of weird how they've restructured these dialogues. We have the empty project, we have APIs, we have web applications with MVC, we have the SPA stuff, and there's also the Blazor pieces and other things.
That was at a higher level. Right?
Yeah.
Like on the first screen, you were given the option of Blazor.
I don't quite understand why some things are at certain levels and others aren't. But there's lots of different ways that you can create a .NET app.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's kind of
gRPC.
And there's gRPC. Yeah. So we'll start digging into some of these and look at what they do and when you might choose to use them in your projects.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks for that episode. And thank you, listeners and watchers, for watching and listening, not necessarily in that order. And we'll see up in the next episode. While we are gone, you can spend your time liking, commenting, sharing, and generally going out and promoting everything that we do in like a Southern Baptist style.
Read our code, preach it from the street corners.
We are not responsible for any tickets you may receive.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers.